Think about a time that you were feeling kind of down and depressed. Did you feel like you had any control over your mood? How about a time when someone said something that hurt your feelings or made you angry? We all can think of times that we've successfully changed our own emotional state to better match the state we wanted to be in, and times that we've actually failed to do this. How does emotion regulation work? Can we learn to do it better? How does it change in aging? These are the questions that we'll be addressing in this module. Emotions are often portrayed as irresistible forces that exert a sweeping influence on behavior. There's reason to believe, however, that people are much more flexible in dealing with their emotions. As it turns out, people can control virtually every aspect of emotional processing, including how emotion directs attention, the cognitive appraisals that shape emotional experience, and the physiological consequences of emotion. These and other processes allow people to manage their own emotions, and they're commonly called emotion regulation. In everyday life, people are continually exposed to potentially emotion-arousing stimuli, ranging from internal sensations like an upset stomach to external events such as juicy gossip about a colleague, or music played in supermarkets. From the fact that these kinds of stimuli only occasionally trigger full-blown emotions, one could infer that people engage in some sort of emotion regulation almost all of the time. But emotion regulation may also become manifested in more overt ways. For instance, there are reliable observations that people may rapidly shift their attention away from threatening stimuli, and that people may overcome traumatic experiences by writing about them, and that people may choose to hit a pillow instead of lashing out at the true cause of their anger. In each of these cases, people resist being carried away or hijacked by the immediate emotional impact of the situation. Emotion regulation can thus be defined as the set of processes whereby people seek to redirect the spontaneous flow of their emotions. One might assume that emotion regulation would always involve reducing emotion, but that's not always the case. Sometimes people may try to experience positive emotion, or even to experience more negative emotion. Why would this be the case? One reason can be the context. For instance, if you're going to attend a funeral, you don't want to be beaming from ear to ear as you think about something exciting and happy. Or if you're trying to get across to a partner that you're not going to tolerate them continuing to behave in a certain way, you may want to turn up the volume on anger. Emotions are generated in a series of stages that include attending to a situation, giving it valenced meaning. So is it something that you think is good or bad? That's called an appraisal. And then producing a loosely coupled set of experiential, behavioral, and physiological responses that then might alter the situation and again be something that you'll have to start paying attention to and evaluating. According to James Gross's process model, emotion regulation is defined when there is an activation of a goal that recruits one or more processes to influence emotion generation. So this is the model that he has, and it really is about the timing at which different things happen. So even before a situation happens, you can select whether you engage with that situation. You could pick up a book that is really sad, or you could avoid it altogether. You could decide not to watch a movie because it looks too scary. You could decide not to call your friend because it seems likely that there might be something emotionally difficult that you'd have to engage with. So situation selection involves efforts to change the complete course of an emotional situation at the earliest stage. Then we get to situation modification. That refers to attempting to change external features of a situation, such as shortening the exposure time to emotional situations. Next, you can try attentional deployment. This moves from trying to modify the external features of the situation to modifying your own early information processing, such as distracting oneself from the attention-grabbing features of an emotional situation. Next up is cognitive change. So this is thinking about the situation in a different way. So you can modify the meaning of the situation, reappraising it to seem less emotional. Finally, we have response modulation, which refers to targeting the latest emotional stage with a modification of the experiential, behavioral, and/or physiological components of an activated emotion response. And one example of this is trying not to show the emotion on your face, or trying not to behave in a way that displays the emotion. So that is the process model that talks about the stages of emotion regulation according as the emotion unfolds and whether something happens early or late. Other ways to describe emotion regulation have categorized them as types of strategies. So one strategy is to accept what's going on, another is to avoid the emotional situation. To try to solve it as a problem is another strategy. And we've already heard about reappraising it, thinking about it differently. Rumination, I'm sure you've all experienced this at some point or another, where you just can't stop thinking or ruminating about something. Perhaps it's something someone said, and your mind just won't let go of it. On the other hand, suppression is trying not to think about something. We talked about trying not to think about a white bear. It can be quite hard sometimes, but it can also be successful in certain cases. Now, what these authors looked at was how these different strategies relate to psychopathology. And what they found is that the higher the psychopathology, the less likely people were to be using acceptance or problem solving or reappraisal in their emotion regulation strategies. So from this perspective, it looks like these three strategies are things that are actually more healthy, whereas the ones that people with psychopathology are using, avoidance, rumination, and suppression, are associated with problematic psychological issues. And if you drill down a little more, you can see that these strategies relate to the psychopathology in different disorders in different ways. So in anxiety and depression, there's not a lot of acceptance, but in substance use disorders, there's no real relationship. And depression is especially high on avoidance, and you can see also that rumination is especially high in anxiety and depression. In this unit, we'll be talking about how emotion regulation relates to the brain. What I want to show you here is an early study that took 57 normal controls, they're shown here with these white boxes, and 279 veterans. And they were matched for age, education, and time in Vietnam. And all of the 279 veterans had received penetrating head injuries during their service in Vietnam. And the researchers got family observations and self-reports using scales and questionnaires that assessed a range of aggressive and violent attitudes and behavior. And what this graph shows is the percentage of items on aggression and violence from these scales endorsed by friend and family of the controls and patients. And in particular, what you see is that patients who had frontal lesions were scoring higher. Their friends and family rated them as being more high. This one here is gets annoyed easily. This one is argues back, talks about how he is mad at people, threatens to tell people off. You can see these frontal lesions were especially likely to increase these tendencies to be more angry and aggressive, presumably less able to suppress or manage one's emotions. And in particular, the patients with frontal ventromedial lesions showed especially high aggression and violence scale scores compared to patients with lesions in other areas. So in the rest of this unit, we'll be talking a little more about how emotion regulation relates to the brain. And then we'll be talking about some really interesting ways that emotion changes in aging.